Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Today we have a very interesting guest, Dr. Bilyana Lilly, and we'll be talking about her background. She is an author. We'll be discussing about her book, which focuses on uh, information warfare, active measures. But she is also in the cybersecurity realm, and we will be discussing how these issues interact among themselves. She is also an advisor to Night Dragon. She's also she's the chair of the Warsaw Security Forum, and we'll be talking about what that is in a minute, and a keynote speaker at various organizations and associations. Welcome to the Washington Outsider Report, and thank you so much for joining us today. Before we delve into the topic of your book, and can you tell us a little bit about your background? How did you come by to be involved in all these things, and what interests you the most? What drives you?
Hi, Irina. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me. So, with regards to my background, I'm originally from Bulgaria. I grew up in Bulgaria. I was a very active child. I was always involved with the Red Cross. I worked with handicapped children and drug addicted people, and I was already a lecturer on international humanitarian law when I was at high school. So, from that early age, I was drawn to thinking about conflict and how to resolve conflict and how to help societies be more protected and how we can defend our well-being as societies. And I would say that first I studied in Germany. I studied international business and politics and economics, but I had a very early on, very original experience. I spent a summer in Kosovo a few years after Kosovo was bombed by Serbia, and I saw what a devastating impact a conflict can have on a country. And when I was there, water wasn't working properly, electricity wasn't working properly, the hospital system wasn't functioning well. So the whole society, even several years after the war, was still suffering the impact from that war. So that's when I decided that I wanted to focus on international conflict and international security and defense issues in my career. And as a result of that experience, I went to Geneva, Switzerland, where I did my master's there and I worked at the United Nations. And from that experience, I was focused a lot on nuclear proliferation, terrorism originating from Russia and Pakistan. And I was focused on the bilateral relationships between the US and Russia, specifically when it comes to disarmament and nuclear weapons. And I focused on that space for about 5 years. But then I moved to the United States and I started my PhD at the Rand Corporation and my work there as a researcher. And that's when we experienced the Russian interference in the 2016 US elections. And when I saw the US response to that interference, I realized that I wanted to focus on Russian information warfare, which includes cyber operations and disinformation and the combination of the two to amplify the effects. Because it was, to me, I realized that this is how Russia fights wars against countries that are far away from Russia's borders. It wouldn't fight the US with kinetic warfare unless it's a proxy war, like in the case of Ukraine. But it will fight us in cyberspace, in the so-called information space, where the Russians are going to try to erode our decision-making or the decision-making of our democratic leadership, and will try to inflict technological damage on our critical infrastructure, specifically for cyber means.
Well, thank you so very much for this introduction. A lot of it resonates with me because my own outlook has been shaped by both 9/11 here in the US and the experiences of that space and my family's Cold War experiences and familiarity with this space that unfortunately remanifested itself after everyone has put that issue seemingly to rest. And of course, waking up to that reality today, waking up to the lack of preparation on the institutional level is something that is not only concerning but handicapping. Um, One of the issues that I'm personally concerned is the lack of institutional communications between the United States and many of the European and other international institutions. The part of your background is, of course, the Warsaw Cyber Forum. Could you tell us a little bit about that, and to what extent do you interact with the US and its institutions? And if not, what do you think is needed to bridge that gap?
Mhm. So the Warsaw Security Forum is an international conference that takes place in Warsaw, Poland every year in October, over 2 to 3 days. And every year there are hundreds of delegates that attend the conference from various NATO member states and also like-minded nations that are either partners, informal partnership with the alliance or informal partnership with the alliance. We had representation from Japan, Singapore, Taiwan, and other countries, for example, last year. We gather about 75 to 80 and more prime ministers and defense ministers and ministers of foreign affairs of NATO member states. We have a huge delegation from Ukraine every year. And the topics for discussion are on the most pertinent cyber, not only cyber, but also international security matters of that particular year. Last year we discussed information warfare, we discussed disinformation, threats to democracies, energy security, how the alliance is responding to the war in Ukraine, and how the alliance can support Ukraine in its efforts to repel Russian aggression further. There were wonderful discussions that were on the record and off the record, and we plan on having a very similar engagement this year at the conference in October.
I think that's a wonderful initiative. US has always been an active NATO member, but for whatever reason, the official activity does not seem to translate into domestic understanding of these policies. And that's a gap that needs to be bridged by more common interactions of that sort, which hopefully, uh, given the success of some of the Russian disinfo ops and active measures, I think should be pursued as much as possible. Uh, you know, a lot has been said about the lack of um, instruments on the Western end in response to the new Cold War 2.0, which seems to be much more integrated. We're not just facing one, Soviet Union. We are facing a multitude of several countries, very in addition to proxy states and in addition to non-state actors joining into the information fray. What is the European approach at looking at this hybrid landscape? Is there a tendency to understand the coalition basis of the threat, or is it still largely mostly focused on Russia per se?
With regards to different European countries and NATO members, including the US, and with regards to whether they're waking up to the type of hybrid warfare that the Russian government has launched with various agents in different countries, yes. I think both from the perspective of visibility and research and from the perspective of policy, we have become much better at identifying the different activities and different aspects of Russia's information warfare in different countries. I would say there's Germany, for example, has done massive improvements in that space. So has France, Estonia, and Norway, Finland. They have always been examples to follow with regards to how they address threats from Russia. Ever since, for example, in Estonia, we had a very I would say, historic moment and a precedent when the Russian government launched 4 waves of DDoS attacks against Ukrainian infrastructure in 2007. Ever since that time, the Ukrainian government has actively addressed the variety of measures that the Russian government would launch against the country, which include protests or support of protests domestically to simulate domestic unrest when it actually the reasons for the particular unrest are professionals or Russians or just paid activists from Russia, disinformation, cyber operations in combination with disinformation. All of these are aspects. Sanctions, the Russian government also would introduce sanctions against a particular country if that will be an effective way to apply pressure on the government. And that is also a part of this idea of active measures or associated measures with information warfare. So I think we've done a lot better in that space. Recently, Germany expelled or identified and expelled a lot of Russian spies across the country, intelligence officers. We've done that before in the States as well and in other countries. That also sends a signal to the Russian government that we are aware of their activities in different aspects of our policies. And I think NATO and the EU also have woken up to a massive extent. Like cyberspace is right now considered a domain of warfare for NATO. The European Union also looks at a variety of subversive activities in the information space. They're tracking disinformation narratives and working actively to debunk them. So I think we've come a long way. And there are also a variety of institutions that have been set to look at these issues specifically. I think we've become much better at identifying the problem. And now I think our main focus should be on identifying solutions that can effectively mitigate the negative effects of the different aspects of the type of information warfare and associated measures against our democracies that we're facing.
So that this is a good time uh, um, to actually mention your book, Russian Information Warfare: Assault on Democracies in the Cyber Wild West. So one of the critical issues, of course, is that the underlying premise here is that, of course, an assault on democracies is bad. It's disruptive. It prevents,
That's right.
it subverts legitimate interests of the people residing in these countries, and it imposes autocratic external uh, distortions and basically hijacks the entire system. However, increasingly, we are seeing that there are many voices disagreeing with the very concept. First, there are groups of people disillusioned with the concept of democracy itself, and others who still believe in democracy, but they believe that the way it is being governed in Western countries has become corrupted. That genuine grievances are not being addressed. That government factions are elitist in they push through agendas without necessarily listening to all voices. We are talking about energy policies, climate change policies, various social issues. So how do we reconcile the fact that on the one hand, democracy is the only form of governance that allows different types of voices, individual concerns to be legitimately incorporated, but on the other hand, these real but also somewhat exaggerated claims by various parties that are essentially seeing no middle ground and no legitimate path to reform other than to reject democracy itself.
Mhm. I think democracy, no system is perfect, and democracy isn't perfect either. But the promise of democracy and the foundation of democracy is that it allows for pluralistic voices to be heard. And I believe that it still maintains that promise. The basis of a democratic system is free and fair elections, when the constituencies of a particular government can choose in a fair and free, uninterrupted voting process their representatives, and there will always be minorities. Throughout the history of democracy, we have always had dissenting and ascending opinions, and that's always been the case. And the fact that we continue to function as different countries without domestic unrest, without massive violence against our governments, without continuous coups, attempts at coups, that demonstrates that the democratic process is working. And I think one of the reasons, because I grew up in a post-communist society, which very much still followed the mentality of the communist state, where one opinion was the dominant opinion. It was very rare to have a dissenting opinion and express it in a way that could actually effectively lead to results. I still believe that democracy, from what I have seen in it, in different countries, in Germany, in Switzerland, in the UK, different countries where I've lived, I believe despite the shocks that we've experienced, such as massive immigration, far right movements, economic crises, democracies still continue to maintain the promise that they will provide, they will care for the well being of their population, and they will provide for the opportunity for free speech, which we see in the West. And I think that only through dialogue of the issues that now we're dealing with climate change, AI, cybersecurity threats, disasters, immigration again. All of these issues, they will continue to be discussed and debated. And I think eventually what we are doing is allowing for opportunities for expression of opinion on a variety of platforms in a variety of ways. And I think that'll continue. And that shows that democracy is resilient. Democracy is not there to dictate one opinion.
Mhm.
It is created for as a platform to allow for the expression of opinions that will then lead to a policy, because eventually in order to have a policy on a problem, we need to agree somehow, we need to reach a compromise. And I still believe, despite all the issues that we have, even in the United States, with Democrats and Republicans, with a variety of the information space and all sorts of noise there, with deep fakes and disinformation, we still see a democracy that is functioning and surviving despite the challenges that it faces.
Now you also describe the concept of the cyber Wild West and how Russia is trying to take advantage of that concept. Essentially, the idea is that lack of appropriate regulation or a framework for governance, for effective governance, leaves loopholes and for exploitation by
Exactly.
bad actors. Now, to what
Exactly.
extent do you think this is really, uh, to what extent is it even possible to regulate cyberspace? How can an international community with a very divergent views on
Hmm.
privacy, security, freedom of speech, and so forth come together to avoid actors like Russia from abusing the concept of internet freedoms?
Irina, that's a great question, and I think it's one that we definitely have to address better. Right now, defense defense definitely is at a disadvantage in cyberspace in comparison to offense. And our legal frameworks that currently exist, they are in favor of the aggressors, because we can't agree even on an international cybercrime treaty at the United Nations that has been discussed for years. We can't even agree on basic concepts there. It's unlikely that, for example, in the US, despite the fact that there's a unanimous understanding around the fact that deepfakes could cause a threat to elections, especially the US elections in 2024, it's unlikely that we will have a bipartisan legal bill at the federal level about how to address deepfakes or regular deepfakes before the election. So we have a very slow legal process, very slow legal landscape that aggressors such as China, Iran, North Korea, hacktivists, Russia, ransomware criminal groups originating from different states that are not the US or not NATO member states also take advantage of. And I think in order to address this problem, one solution that I would start from, and this has been discussed before, is to focus on critical infrastructure and make sure that critical infrastructure is off the table. Sign a treaty that explains that stipulates clearly that critical infrastructure and outline the different components of what that includes will not be either will not be a subject to any type of stage of cyber operations, be it passive or active reconnaissance, be it placement of malware, identification of vulnerabilities, and so on. But it's very difficult to even enforce, even if unanimously and globally we can create such a framework. We have a number of calls and treaties out there that have been signed. Countries have pledged to, for example, um, not target critical infrastructure, but it is difficult to enforce. Even if you see the political will from countries, it is very difficult to enforce, because one very easy way, for example, to circumvent this this ban that, let's say, this pledge that, let's say, governments have made, is to use non-state actors that are loosely affiliated with governments that would still continue attacks against critical infrastructure. Let's say ransomware groups originating from Russia or North Korea that still launch ransomware attacks against US hospitals and the financial sector. So even if government to government we agree to a certain framework, there are enough non-state actors that the framework will not apply to that will continue to disrupt cyberspace.
We are seeing that the landscape is becoming increasingly complex. There's divergence in views between European Union and US on certain regulatory issues and frameworks. There's internal disputes over everything ranging from managing data privacy and security and who should be in charge of that, really, to the legitimacy of governments interfering with private social media companies, to the biases in the media, to the simple lack of preparedness and simple ignorance of basic technical issues by various institutions. Is there any way to reconcile these divergent interests in a way that promotes a more pluralistic approach to decision making and that makes it more difficult for any particular group to be hijacked, isolated, or polarized?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, and there there are so many aspects to it, Irina. I think um, I think a way to address it is country by country and by focusing clearly and agreeing clearly first on the threats, on why we need a framework. For example, uh, let's take um, let's take social media for example, and in disinformation and deepfakes at the moment. We can all agree that um, deepfakes created by adversaries such as Russia and China wouldn't be created with the good intentions. They will be created with the intention of influencing an election in the interest of the particular adversary. If we can agree within the stakeholders such as social media companies and the government and the constituency in the United States that those particular deepfakes should be regulated and removed from platforms as soon as possible because they represent the interests of a foreign government, which is an adversary, then perhaps we could formulate policies around those more clear problems. But even in that space, you will find a lot of issues with how exactly do you recognize a deep fake? How exactly do you identify the origin of a deep fake quickly? How exactly do you regulate it from a network? How quickly can you remove it from platforms? Like a lot of issues exist around that. We could try to focus on sector specific cyber operations and limiting specific cyber operations. Let's say the water, dam and water systems in the US have been subject to periodic cyber intrusions by nation states like Iran and Russia. And we could, for example, have a treaty specifically focused on the water systems in the US. But that probably will be impossible given the current level of animosity between Russia and the US. I think in general, I see cybersecurity as a political problem. I
Mhm.
think a lot of cyber activity against critical infrastructure, against companies and targets in general, could be significantly reduced if the governments agree to contain cyber activity within their borders and deal with cyber activity within their borders against another. For example, in the case of Russia, I believe it will be very effective if our governments could at the president level, Biden to Putin level, be able to negotiate a treaty of um, something along the lines of restraint in cyberspace or
Mhm.
agreement not to target each other and critical infrastructure. But because of the animosity around the war in Ukraine and everything else, I believe that Russia feels emboldened and is actively leveraging its cyber tools against the United States because it just doesn't see a reason to hold back at the moment.
So for the time being, US and other Western countries hold a significant advantage when it comes to more sophisticated innovation tools like generative AI. However,
That's right.
that advantage is likely to be erased over time. And second, there is no such advantage when it comes to more mundane cybersecurity issues, phishing operations, various forms of hacking, and so forth. Why isn't there a significant advantage, and why is our critical infrastructure so um, rife for exploitation given the pharmaceutical sector, the hospital sector, but also just major corporations who seem to be hiring the best and the brightest in the cybersphere, and yet we are actually hearing more frequent attacks and data breaches and the disablements of critical infrastructure. What's behind this?
Yeah, I think there first the volume, speed, scope of cyber attacks has increased significantly, and I believe we're still improving our defenses rapidly. AI has helped defenders a lot. Even at the recent RSA conference in San Francisco last week, some of the major cybersecurity vendors revealed how they are integrating AI into their EDR solutions, into their cybersecurity suite in general. You had Palo Alto, CrowdStrike, and a lot of others unveil how they're going to use or how they're already leveraging AI to improve cyber defense, to reduce the speed of response to cyber incidents. So we are massively improving with AI technology our ability to respond and mitigate cyber threats. So I think that's definitely improved. But there is an issue here that's very important to mention, and this is implementation. We have various industries with various budgets, and because of that, we have some industries that are very much target rich but resource poor because the internet and a lot of technologies weren't built with the idea that they will be targeted in cyber operations in mind. So you have a lot of legacy technologies,
Mm-hmm.
specifically in industrial sectors where machines, factories cost millions, billions of dollars to reproduce and redesign, and they rely on legacy systems that need to be protected in different ways. And protection and cybersecurity has to be layered on already existing industrial control systems, industrial systems and processes that is very hard to that are very hard to adjust to the current challenges. So I think because of that, you see some sectors because their budgets are small, they're target rich but resource poor. Their budgets for cybersecurity are small. You see the integration of the necessary cybersecurity controls, even the basic ones, as lagging and being more and more difficult because of budgetary constraints. But you do have both on offense and defense significant improvement because of AI.
Well, that brings us to the next point of concern, which is a lot of, as much as technology is central to the issue of cybersecurity, the human factor still by far remains the biggest source of the issues. Simple lack of training, lack of awareness, or the ability of spies to penetrate and hijack human personnel or to corrupt human cybersecurity mechanisms. So,
Yes.
what's the best way to address the human factor and to make the human factor at the forefront of the discussion? We have seen very few efforts in that regard, and in fact, as even security agency often try to cover up this problem rather than to address it upfront.
I think education inside the threat awareness program, counterintelligence training, all of that is very important for any member of the cybersecurity community, I would say, not just the government. Everyone who has a clearance in the US government needs to go through those trainings. But a lot of the members of the private sector who are still dealing with critical information and critical cybersecurity issues that could be a target of a foreign government and foreign adversary aren't being trained in those particular aspects that you mentioned. And I think they're very important, Irina. I have claimed for a long time that Russia's most powerful weapon are its women. I think that is like the human factor and the way that those women and also China most likely
Mhm.
that they target our professionals is top notch. They're very qualified. They know what they're doing, and I think we have to train our staff members to be better at discerning the intentions of individuals that they befriend and that approach them. But also, insider threat is a big problem. A lot of breaches start from an insider, it could be a disgruntled employee
Mhm.
that decides to take a bribe from a foreign entity without even knowing what the entity is because the person is aggrieved because of the policies of the organization or for ideological reasons or just purely for financial gain. So there are a variety of factors that could um, persuade someone inflict damage on their own organization without even understanding the repercussions of that. So I think education, spreading more awareness about cases where we have had individuals that breach organizations or um, have been compromised because of a foreign asset. I think that is key.
So you wrote the book in 2022, in the early stages of the war in Ukraine. Since then, have you seen any changes in the dynamics involving Russia's role in the cyberspace, and how would you describe any potential changes and patterns?
That's a great question, Irina. I think we've all been looking at Ukraine and Russia's activities in cyberspace in Ukraine in order to learn about how Russia reacts, how Russia uses cyber warfare during a kinetic war. And we've learned a lot. I'd say first, Russia's cyber activities towards the West have not ceased. We had thousands of Russian espionage campaigns being launched against NATO member states over the past few years. We've had a few disruptive incidents, but I think from what we're seeing, I think the Russian focus currently, because of resource constraints and all the sanctions we've imposed and the changing trade relationships with Europe and China, I think Russia is primarily focused on the Ukrainian theater of operations. And that is why we're seeing a lot less disruptive and sophisticated cyber attacks
Mhm.
against the US and against other countries. But I think we also see Russia has limits in cyberspace. I think they're constrained with regards to resources because since the war, different we obviously don't have the exact statistics because a lot of Russians fled the country illegally, clandestinely since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022 and Putin's. You probably remember this, the announcement of partial mobilization in Russia,
Mhm.
a lot of Russians fled the country. And among them were about 10% of Russia's IT force. And when we think about who is able to leave a country in distress on a short notice and basically relocate outside of the country, that these are usually people with already existing resources, with connections abroad, who can speak a foreign language, who have been traveling abroad. So these are usually the educated, wealthy individuals or the upper class. So I would imagine that a lot of the 10 of those 10% of IT uh, workers that left the country to be really among the elite of Russia's IT forces. So I think we're going to see Russia right now. There's a focus on rebuilding that IT force domestically. And I think we're going to see how Russia is adapting to the current constraint that it's experiencing over the next few years. And I think in that respect, we will see until then more reliance on non-state actors who are loosely affiliated with the government, like ransomware threat actors. And we see a lot of those ransomware groups like Lockbit, for example, that have wreaked so much havoc on US companies. And you see law enforcement in the US and other countries tackling them very effectively, reducing their effect, but having disruptive effects on their infrastructure. And that's being helpful. But I think going forward, we will see a lot of hacktivists from Russia and neighboring states that are like-minded target the US a lot more and other countries because of the war in Ukraine. And I think Russia's more sophisticated cyber threat actors will be focused on Ukraine and perhaps a lot will be focused partially on the US, especially around the 2024 US election, because Russia sees this as a major opportunity to wreak havoc before and after the election. And I want to mention this, especially after the election, because one party, half of the country, will be so angry because of the choice of president, whoever it is, half of the US half of the US will be angry. And that's the perfect opportunity for Russia to exploit our grievances and our anger and just spark through maybe deep fakes, through some disinformation narrative about whatever it is, maybe an explosion in a voting in a voting location or some issue around immigration or abortion. I think they're going to try to stage rallies that would lead to violence, like what happened on January in the United States and the attempted coup against the Capitol a few years ago. I think we see from both China, actually not both, but China, Iran, and Russia, I think may try to exacerbate the grievances that exist, especially after the elections.
It would help if the US chose if US parties choose less polarizing and unpopular candidates would make fewer people angry, but that's
I would love to see that, Irina. You're right. Let's try. I would love for this to happen. Yes, unfortunately, from the way everything is developing, and you're probably also following the stories around Trump's trial and everything else, I think we're going to be headed in a very heated election with a lot of opportunities for foreign adversaries to
Mhm.
exploit our grievances, unfortunately.
And I was actually going to bring up that point later, but now is as good time as any, which is the fact that you point to a variety of factors, hybrid warfare, not only hacking and ransomware and hacktivism online with all sorts of political messaging, troll factors, and so forth, but we are
That's
also
right.
seeing a different type of interference in the election through funding, through creation of lobbies, and through using third parties to essentially manipulate and dictate the course of the elections. And we are seeing that some of it can be effective. One of
Absolutely.
the issues that is not particularly popular to discuss, which is the role of Hungary, Viktor Orban specifically, in financing campaigns for pro-Russian parties and candidates throughout
Yes.
Central and Eastern Europe. And we've
Yes.
seen what happened in Slovakia. What are the chances that this will prove equally effective in other countries where the elections are coming up?
Very high, unfortunately. I wish I had better news for you, but very high. Yes, I've tracked that for a few years now, and in some countries, when parties do not have to disclose the sources of their funding, that's where the Russians are really exploiting the system. And I've
Mhm.
personally looked a few years ago when I looked at the case of Bulgaria through the funding reports of a party named Attack, which is a far right party, and they just don't disclose. They say, okay, we received $1 million from a funder. That's it. That's it. And we have photos of the leader of the political party shaking hands with Russians in Russia's parliament and going around Russia. So it's clear that there's a connection, but because Bulgarian law doesn't explicitly stipulate that parties, at least at that time, that parties should disclose the source of their funding explicitly, then the party could just cover it. And we had also, I think that is a major problem, and thank you for bringing it up. For example, in Germany during the believe 2017 election, when for the first time Alternative für Deutschland gathered seats in the parliament, that was very rare, first time since the Second World War that happened, and that party had Russian backing. On Russian, even if it wasn't for funding, I believe there was also a funding element, but they were getting a lot of coverage on Russian news channels that are traditionally Russian sponsored, and they basically gained a lot of popularity among minorities and groups that were aggrieved about immigration in Germany and other issues, and now have a voice in the German parliament.
So that brings me to yet another point related to all of this, which is attempted coups, violence, and various other more serious attempts at interference than just mere political manipulation and funding. First of all, there was recently news that Russia is about to unleash far-right extremists with violent tendencies to pursue terrorist attacks, although they've also appear to have been collaborating with far left extremists, such as the Red
Mhm.
Army faction in Germany, which has recently been appears to have been revitalized.
Exactly.
There, and it's not clear how these people are being tracked, really, especially if they're quietly recruiting new members. And simultaneously today, we have the news of the Slovakian pro-Russian prime minister being nearly assassinated, ending up in critical conditions.
Yes,
Regardless of how it happened, this will benefit Russia's interests, which
absolutely.
leads to the question to what extent it's possible that something like that could be a deliberate provocation, and what do you think may happen in the future? How can this be used to spread pro-Russian martyrdom message among vulnerable countries?
This is you're in so many great questions. Like I had so many ideas, and you're just piling the awesome questions. I forget what I wanted to say on even the first ones. But these are great questions. This is a massive problem. This is a massive problem, and I think closer to Russia's borders in Eastern and Central Europe, it is harder to monitor for these influences because of the very still significant and present legacy of Russia's ties with those countries because of communism, because of the Cold War and the Eastern Bloc. I believe in those countries there are sympathizers domestically that are still very pro-Russian, and it is easier to create those types of social disturbances in them. I think the Russians are leveraging very effectively our existing grievances and are exactly as you pointed out, they're not just sponsoring the far right, but they're sponsoring the far left. They're going with whoever is extremist because their goal is to polarize us. And it doesn't matter on what topic. And I think this is where I'm very worried about the United States. I think there is even potential to spread that here. And I very much hope that our I know that our FBI, our basically law enforcement, is very much focused on this problem, and we don't get all the information about all the cases that they're dealing with, but they are addressing it, and I very much pray that they will continue to be able to be effective in that space. I do imagine, because this is right out of Russia's playbook, for these efforts to intensify our grievances, to train like they've even done that in Moldova, like train actual activists to go out and pick up arms and become violent during protests. I very much hope that I think that they're going to exploit our grievances and try to intensify those efforts in the months to come. And I very much hope that our law enforcement services are well prepared to address that.
One particularly interesting factor which has not really been discussed quite as much is the mainstreaming of fringe ideas, fringe activists, and fringe personalities and agendas. These so-called extremists who used to be relatively minor and they were viewed as essentially isolated nutcases have gained prominence in part to deliberate boosting on social media, in part because of the scandalous nature of their activity which draws the media, and in part
Absolutely.
because they form effective alliances with various interests within mainstream parties. How can we avoid that from happening, or prevent that from happening? Can it be avoided given the fact that increasingly we're seeing more and more mainstream individuals literally switch sides for whatever reason, because of pressure, because of social context, as these ideas become more and more popular, and it's hard to call them fringe or undemocratic once they've taken so much root.
That's right. I think education is the key here. I think we can apply all sorts of regulation on social media,
Mhm,
downrate messages that have been spread by those individuals the moment but then we infringe on freedom of
mhm.
speech issues. But I think where it becomes dangerous is when they start advocating for actual violence, for actual aggression. I think that's when we can prevent it. But the most important, I think, aspect, the most effective policy is to educate our own population about the dangers of these narratives, and we have to educate them on how to be critical consumers of information. I don't think in the US we do a good job of that. I think when I've studied different examples of Russian information warfare and subversive activities in different countries, it's easier to see how, in the cases of Norway, in Estonia, the governments, but also the populations have this resiliency built into their in
Mhm.
their perception, in their media literacy, through media literacy and other aspects of their just daily lives and education. They the the Russian disinformation narratives and subversive activities don't pick up as much, don't get as much audience as they do in the US. And I think here, because our community is so focused on reality TV and social media, and we literally live it on the internet, I think if we have more education around the dangers of these platforms and how to find reputable information, what sources are news and what sources are noise, I think this has to be literally mandatory education in high schools, in middle schools, in universities all across the US. I think that's what we have to do.
Ironically, the very debate about the nature of polarization, social polarization we are facing, has become greatly polarized. To give you an example, and I'm curious what you think, there was recently a debate between an activist and a senior US politician concerning whether populism is a threat to democracy. Now,
Mm-hmm.
to me, the answer is very, very simple. If they could just put one word in that sentence, the controversy would have been dead and there'd be no debate. And that one word would be when. When is the when is populism a threat to democracy? Because
Mm-hmm.
obviously elements of populist flair are necessary. They're necessary to show that the government is listening to the people grievances, and it's necessary
Exactly.
to create these links. But of course, uncontrolled populism, just like uncontrolled self-isolation of the ruling classes or institutional leadership, obviously brings about destructive results. However, this is not most most people don't necessarily in the current situation look at it this way. So this the very way such questions are posed seems to only increase the disconnect and instead of focusing on problem solving,
Mm-hmm.
essentially otherizes the other side of the debate. So, what can we do to disrupt this dynamic which has emerged from everyone, all these forces vying for power of the discourse?
Mm-hmm. I think raising the level of education, and usually when you have populism during unfavorable economic times, when there is a massive, let's say, crisis that a country is going through, when you have immigration, for example, in Germany, when we had massive immigration from the Middle East, that's when we started seeing populism rising in other countries as well. Whenever you have a problem, typically economic or social problem that addresses that impacts the entire population, then the population looks for answers and they think that populism can provide those answers. I think that perception is wrong. I think democracy is made to be resilient during crises. And as long as we see those natural ebbs and flows of populist movements that then decline in times of prosperity and relatively stable well being of a population, then I think democracy is still healthy and still maintaining its promise of delivering to its population, taking care of its population, and allowing for pluralism in the country. But I think a healthy democracy will allow for those movements to exist, but they shouldn't be the majority. Because it means if populists are the majority, this means that democracy isn't answering the demands or the requests of its own population.
And this is unfortunately what we seem to be seeing because the more these voices are, on the other side, essentially not taking these concerns into consideration and doubling down on their own rhetoric, and the more some of these populist leaders are all also not necessarily acting in 100% good faith. It's power, after all.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Breaking down social norms is also a power for those who are busy breaking them down. So we're seeing a very chaotic environment, which obviously, of course, makes it easy for Russia and others to interfere and hijack absolutely everyone involved. And it doesn't help when, on the other hand, you have populist groups being hijacked by conspiracy theories and all sorts of extreme discourse. And on the other hand, you have so-called elite government institutional leaders forging ties with autocracies for entirely financial reasons. So it seems to me that Russia, China, etc., are playing both sides of this populist debate with equal success. So how
Mm-hmm.
do we break through and realize that they're winning, we're all collectively losing, and this sort of reform of corruption in our institutions has to somehow be done in a more manageable way.
Mm-hmm. Government transparency and debunking fake narratives for me will be the way to do it, because as long as I think eroding our own trust in our institutions is the danger here. And as long as we continue to disagree within a healthy, stable governance system, I think democracy is healthy. But we have to get to the point where we can understand what a true narrative is, and we have to agree on what a true narrative is. And at this point, I think this is where the strength of Russia, China, and Iran is that they play on our inability to discern truth and facts, truth from fake news, because of the variety of sources that we rely on for our information.
Well, having a plurality in the media is could also be one of our strengths. The question is how in the middle of a crisis which we are facing, how do we build that resilience quickly? How do we cut through the conspiracy theories quickly? Because some of it takes decades to build up,
Absolutely.
just as it was
Absolutely.
took decades to tear down and create this institutional lack of resilience and lack of preparation among young people and others. Or clearly the fact that some of these narratives proliferated as quickly as they did showed that people were there was some internal openness to this sort of very emotional kind of gravitation to
Exactly.
to logical fallacies that appeal to authorities of sorts.
That's right.
It's that takes time. We don't necessarily have that time. Not that we shouldn't be doing it for the future anyway, but what do we do about the current situation where we are at a full-on attack and we have no tools. We have no government programs, we have no organized private programs of any kind, and we don't have any sort of organized effort. We have just various institutions at odds with each other and with the population.
Well, there are various programs that are offering training for the population. There are various websites that are debunking different narratives. I think the U.S. government has done um, tremendous strides in the direction of those policies, and I think there are resources out there. But the big problem is that the population isn't willing to use them. That's where I think we have to improve. And I'd start by labeling the major news media, for example, the major news channels in the US on what is mostly opinion, what is fact-based reporting. I think we have to make a major distinction
Mhm.
between those two. And we have to very clearly explain social media is not a source of news unless if it's an article from a reputable media agency that has existed for a long time, is staffed with journalists who are professionals. Unless those articles are being shared on social media, media should not be used as a resource of information. And I think because of our current situation where social media is used a lot for news, I think that we're going to see a lot of our adversaries exploiting that environment, unfortunately.
Well, one of the other issues that Russia is very much using effectively is the journalism crisis. The fact that business models of traditional media have failed, that opinionating has infiltrated some of the previously relatively reliable institutions, that increasingly narratives are at least are as prominent as fact-based reporting, and this issue of media bias is what has caused people to distrust in the media as much, if not more, as they distrust in the government, to turn to social media for allegedly unbiased views from their favorite sources, which at the end of the day only promotes confirmation bias, but that also doesn't take away from media responsibility for this problem to begin with. So we have an issue of money, financing. How do the fact that centrist or balanced sources don't hold much popular appeal in this environment, and the fact that many of these news agencies are not willing to depart from their current trajectory. How do we deal with this without allowing Russia, China, and Iran and others to benefit from this disconnect?
That's a great question. And funding is always an issue. It will be great to see more government funding at the federal level for different literacy programs. I think that could
Mhm.
be a way to address the issue. I think if we educate our consumers, then the media will naturally adjust to its audience and to its markets. But we have to start by educating the consumers.
Yeah, unfortunately, it doesn't sound like there's a quick fix. And that brings me to another point that's just as important, which is the law enforcement aspect of it, because we've talked a little about some of the successes in international law enforcement cooperation, like taking down the Lockbit gang and some of these other uh, criminal Russia affiliated outfits. But at the same time, as Russia continues to expand its reach into these non-state actor realms, these groups will become more widely scattered, more prominent, and harder to track down, especially if U.S. relationship with third-party countries suffers. We are seeing Russia strengthen its influence in Africa. We are seeing BRICS become a way, an economic and technical way of excluding the US and some of the NATO countries. So how do we overcome this issue of deteriorating political influence around the world, which gives Russia human and technical resources to subvert our democracies?
We continue to educate our own population and shine by example. And I think that happens by showing that we have legitimate elections, that we have a legitimate and fair election process, which hopefully will happen. And we basically show that we're still a country that is a advocate of democracy and we continue to show our example as such. I think Russia, you're right, has become very influential in different African countries, in Latin America as well, through its media channels and because of the war in Ukraine. And I think we have to actively debunk these narratives by having our own message being more clear
Mhm.
and proliferated better through not through disinformation, but through media channels that also convey the US perspective and the NATO perspective and the democratic perspective, which I think that we aren't doing as well.
So interesting that you mentioned the issue of messaging. So many people are complaining about the lack of clarity in US messaging, whether on the political discourse aimed at other countries or internally. Seem to be struggling with defining who we are, and there is some sort of a self-disgust and self-criticism that's not always constructively handled. On the other hand, everyone's claiming that Russia, China, and so forth have very clear messaging about themselves, even if they're brought about by completely authoritarian means. My question is, how do we show that it's not the case? That in fact, Russia's self-image is at least as modeled and incoherent. That
Hmm.
the fact is, it presents itself as a stronghold of conservatism to some people, as a it well, to the others it's obviously a very corrupt state with a lot going on, but an opportunity for to make money easily. Those things are completely contradictory, and yet Russia somehow manages to hold both types of audiences with this message.
I think we continue to proliferate our message, and we've done a good job of showing protests in Russia, the response to the partial mobilization in Russia, the response to the war, the massive activity from mothers of soldiers that have gone missing or killed in action during the war. I think we're doing a good job of showing those those inaccuracies and inadequacies in Russia's policy and the domestic crisis and nightmare that has been caused by that war. I think we have to continue to spread that message abroad accurately and in a fact based manner while avoiding disinformation. I think we should not get into that space. We should just convey our message clearly. And we're doing this through a variety of Western channels, and we should just continue with that.
At the end of the day, neither Russia, China, nor Iran are stronger the United States and Europe collectively. Still, they managed to do a lot of damage by simply preying on vulnerabilities. So, how do we highlight our strength and resilience? Even despite all these messy situations, our economies are better. We have, especially in the US, has better military. And, despite all the culture wars and so forth, at the end of the day, we are not committing a genocide against Uyghurs or discriminating against ethnic minorities like in Russia or Iran for that matter. So how do we kind of refocus from grievances to the fact that we have our strengths even if we are not perfect?
Yes, I think leading by example, Irina, and having clear spokespersons that will articulate our message is the way to go. I think creating cultural institutions, opening up our universities, which we've already done, and are continuing to do for foreign students so they can come and experience our educational system, experience the United States, and see our type of life here is how we can continue to battle effectively these threats.
Wrapping up, my question for you, what's next? What's next for you, and what do you see as the next logical follow-up step to in this battle?
So for me, specifically in this respect, I have a few announcements for professional roles, but they're still in the making, so I will hold back.
Mhm.
But for me, the next step is I really want to educate the American public about the fact that they could be targets of influence operations from China, Russia, and a number of other countries. So I actually wrote a novel. It's a fiction book based on some of my experiences, but it's fictionalized about how some Chinese and Russian actors are trying to subvert our democracy using AI and fake narratives. And I hope it will be published soon and I will be able to promote it and talk more about it. But I would like to use the power of storytelling to reach more audiences and tell them about how they have to be more aware of the dangers that they can encounter on social media and in the information space in general.
You mentioned a great point, storytelling, because, on the one hand, for decades we've been told about the power of narrative, of storytelling,
Exactly.
of personal accounts, and yet in this whole space it has been tragically underplayed for whatever reason.
I agree. But if you look at my book, in some of the chapters, you have assassinations, explosions, an attempted coup. Like it actually gets really action packed.
Well,
So
that's great.
I've tried a little bit to touch upon that issue. But like the Russians are so evil and so subversive and so creative in their evil geniuses that I didn't really have to create anything. It was just there. I just had to tell it. So
Yeah,
hopefully that captures the readers a little bit and captivates their attention.
well, I personally look forward to seeing it whenever it comes out and reading it. And thank you so much for joining us today and for highlighting these important issues. They're complex. There are no easy answers necessarily, but I think the truth is in the debate itself. I think the process itself is important, and having these conversations and insights is important. Thank you for joining us. Thanks for everyone
Thank
who
you.
tuned in. We'll be back next Tuesday night at 9 p.m. as usual, and have a